All right. Okay, Chapter 64, Response to Hazardous Material Incidents. This is a lengthy chapter. This is typically something that is covered in about 12 hours, and we're going to try to cover it in about an hour and 15 minutes, so you'll understand or appreciate the brevity. Hazardous materials can be solids, liquids, or gases capable of harming people, the environment, or property, and we find them all around us. They're in industrial locations, they're in swimming pools, hospitals. We're an extremely agricultural based state, so we've got a lot of agricultural chemicals around us that we need to be aware of, as well as even in our own homes. As an emergency medical responder, you're going to come in contact with people that have been exposed to hazardous materials. And how you manage them may determine not only the outcome on the patient, but whether or not you become a patient yourself. Remember that hazardous materials can also harm you. When we talk about specific personal protective equipment a little later, keep in mind that one of the complications of wearing this personal protective equipment or suiting up is heat stress, particularly on a hot and humid day. Now, OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency both have training requirements. The mandatory safety procedures for responders is one of those, and the NFPA is in there as well. The National Fire Protection Agency identifies the awareness level training for hazmat awareness for EMS personnel, and we know that that's not sufficient enough, particularly where I come from. The reality is that when you show up on scene and you're dealing with patients who are contaminated that may need some care, they're not going to wait an hour or two for a hazmat team to come up from some other city. They're going to either self-transport to the hospital and present contaminated, or they are going to come up to your ambulance. So we believe that EMS providers need to at least be at the operations level so that they can participate in decontamination. HAZWOPER is the Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response regulation for OSHA. And we'll look at, there are a couple different pieces of that, of those regulations. Awareness, as I've already mentioned, is they say the objectives take about 8 hours to get through. We refer to the awareness training as the rule of thumb. If you can obscure the scene by holding your thumb out in front of you, then you know you're far enough away. Then you get your binoculars out. You try to recognize and identify the hazardous material, isolate anybody from getting any closer, and call for a hazmat team. Operations level, that's where you can operate in a defensive manner. In other words, people start showing up. You don't make direct intentional contact with the substance, but it does allow you to participate in decontamination. Training objectives are about 12 hours to get through the operations level. And the technician, that's where you make direct intentional contact with the spilled material to decrease the problem. So here they're talking more about something that a firefighter or somebody that would have to clean the chemicals up, prevent further contamination at the site, those sort of things. We're more concerned, of course, with treating patients that have been exposed to these chemicals. Technician trained is no better at treating patients than we are. They just have the technical knowledge to go into the red zone, pull those patients out, or the hot zone, pull those patients out and bring them back so they can be deconned. Training objectives is take several days to become a certified technician, and we saw them in the police departments and sheriff's departments, at least in our area, as a direct result of meth labs. The HAZWOPER training specialist is a specialized focused knowledge about an aspect of response, and these trainings could be days to several weeks depending on the individual type of hazardous material that you're dealing with. When we're dealing with a hazardous scene, it's important that we do set up incident command, and incident command will take control of the incident and direct the response of the operation. Actually, the incident commander will, and that typically in most situations is the fire chief. But you can have a unified command where you've got the incident commander, the fire chief, in control of the incident and the direct response operation of that incident. And you could have a medical incident commander in there as well that's more responsible for patient care. The National Fire Protection Agency has voluntary training competencies. They list them as Level 1, that's caring for a patient in a cold zone. Level 2, caring for a patient while wearing personal protective equipment in a warm zone. And the thing to remember about hazardous materials is that their presence isn't always apparent, particularly when you're dealing with something like carbon monoxide. Methane has a pretty unique odor, as does chlorine and ammonia. Phosphine, some of those have very distinct odors, so that might be present. But things like carbon monoxide certainly is odorless and non-irritating, so it may not be apparent. Same thing with cyanide, it may not be apparent. But when you look around and you've got multiple patients who have the same symptoms, you should be thinking about a hazmat scene. If you look around and there's dead animals or dead vegetation in lawns, you certainly should be thinking about a hazmat scene. Or numerous surfaces that have oily films or droplets on them. We affectionately refer to our law enforcement friends as vertical cop indicators. Often law enforcement is first on scene, and if they're upright and vertical, then the scene is typically safe. But if you arrive on scene and they're down with the multiple patients, then you know the scene is not safe. In any event, recognizing and identifying the materials is the most important at this initial point. Transportation of hazardous materials are governed by the United States Department of Transportation. They regulate containers, markings, modes of transportation, and the documentation needed to transport hazardous chemicals. Transportation containers include non-bulk, which are smaller individual packages, bags and sacks filled with solids, or bottles filled with solids or liquids, or drums filled with solids and liquids. You get up to some of the larger containers like carboys or cylinders. And of course, with larger containers, they can carry a larger amount of hazardous material. Some other transportation containers include bulk containers, large containers and tanks, intermodal tank containers, which you'll see on the highway, the railway, and in water, on barges, ships, those sort of things. Ton cylinders refer to pressurized tanks that hold liquefied gases. And radioactive materials are packaged in protective casks, and then you have cargo tanks as well. Some way to identify a particular container and perhaps what might be in there is certainly by shape. If you look at the MC306, they're elliptical. In other words, they're not quite a perfect circle, but they are elliptical. They'll hold up to 9,000 gallons, typically liquid. Lighter than water, and as an example would be your hydrocarbons, and your hydrocarbons are your gasoline and your kerosene and those sort of things. Your containers here that look, they even look more formidable. They may have stiffener rings around them. Those are your MC307. They hold about 5,000 to 6,000 gallons of liquid that's heavier than water, and they include things like corrosives and poisons. Your MC311 are pressurized containers that hold liquids or gases. Your MC338s can be your cryogenic tanks. They're heavily insulated. They have to keep the product cold. And you also have tube trailers and rail cars. Tube trailers are shown on the very bottom of that. Multiple tubes, each tube containing chemicals, and then rail cars containing chemicals as well. You can have hopper cars. They're non-pressurized. And one way to tell whether a car is pressurized or not, or the contents in there have to be pressurized or not, is where they unload. If a car unloads from the bottom, then that's a non-pressurized liquid, like an egg product or something like that. Where if it's a pressurized liquid, then the valves are going to be on the top of the container. Pipelines are also considered transportation containers. That's not something that we think about, but they may carry different products at different times, but they are considered transportation containers. The Department of Transportation requires containers to be marked with placards. Placards are something that are going away. What is being phased in is the global harmonizing system for hazardous communications, and they will require vehicles to have pictograms, and the material safety data sheets that many of us are familiar with will go away, and if not already have been replaced with safety data sheets. In any event, the Reader's Digest condensed version of the safety data sheets can be found in the Emergency Response Guidebook, and I've listed here the web address that you can go to download the PDF. They also have it as an app that you can download to your smartphone as well, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit. Placards have a specific color. They have a symbol at on top that gives you an idea of what sort of chemical you're dealing with. There may be a 4-digit identification number in the placard, and the 4-digit ID number you will find in the yellow pages, I believe, of the Emergency Response Guidebook, and the name of the chemical you'll find in the blue pages, and you can use those to look up a 3-digit guide number in the orange pages. That gives you the safety data sheet. The Department of Transportation initially has classified all chemicals in 9 different classes: explosives, gases, flammable and combustible liquids, flammable solids, oxidizing substances, poisons, radioactive substances, corrosives, and then miscellaneous. And here is an example of those placards. On the left are placards that you may see on a vehicle, and again, if you've got the app for your smartphone, you can just type in that particular number and it'll tell you what the chemical is and give you the safety data sheet for that chemical. On the right is the same sort of placards that you'll see on shipping containers, things that are being shipped in boxes. Documentation are going to include shipping papers, and they have to accompany all hazardous materials. And the RQ identification, I believe, has to deal with the... I'm gonna have to look that one up. I did know it at one point as I was preparing for this presentation, but I can't seem to remember what the RQ identification is. I think it's the amount. At a certain amount, you don't need shipping papers, but if it gets over a certain amount, then they have to be placarded. They have to have this or that, because some chemicals, corrosives, oxidizers, those sort of things, if they're under 1,000 pounds, they may just have to have a placard that says dangerous, and if they're under 500 pounds, they don't need to be placarded at all. Storage and handling of hazardous materials, again, bulk pressurized, bulk low pressure, and bulk high pressure storage facilities, and we certainly have many of these, either storing anhydrous ammonia, storing gasoline, storing natural gas. So we have a lot of these around us in our communities. In fixed facilities, the NFPA 704 has the fixed facility placards. It provides information on the material inside the tank. It's a diamond shape with 4 quadrants, and each quadrant is colored, and each quadrant represents something. Red is the fire information, blue is the health information, yellow is the reactivity or the likelihood of detonation information, and then white is specific information about the particular chemical, like don't put any water on it. It'd be a W with a line through it. It uses a 0 to 4 to indicate how hazardous the material is, with 0 being no hazard and 4 being the most severe. So if I knew nothing about those chemicals stored in those tanks, but I see a 301 and a W with a line through it, I can tell that the risk to the health is pretty serious if I'm exposed to that particular chemical. It is not flammable, and it has very little likelihood of detonating, but I should not put water on it. Labels on containers, I showed you some of those already. The hazardous materials ID system, it requires the product name, the protective equipment, the health hazards, the flammability, the reactivity hazards, and this was things that typically we saw on the material safety data sheets. So here's a label that often mimics what you might see on a material safety data sheet, which is now called a safety data sheet. That tells you a little bit about the health, flammability, and reactivity of the product that you're dealing with. EPA hazards have a waste label, hazardous waste label, that identifies the name of the waste, the ID numbers, the name of the waste generator, and the accumulation start date. The EPA also requires labels for pesticides. It needs the name of the pesticide, the signal word indicating how toxic it is, and then the EPA registration number, as well as a precautionary statement, hazardous statement, names of the active ingredients, and here you can see orthoparathion, which is a pesticide, and the important thing for us concerning pesticides is pesticides work very similar to the deadly nerve agents like sarin, soman, and tabin. The use of recognition and identification clues. If you're responding to a particular occupancy, you might know what is made at that particular occupancy and have an idea of what sort of hazardous materials you might run up against. Your knowledge of containers may provide clues to the condition as well. Marking in colors, the fixed facility placards can give you again an idea of how hazardous that stuff is. Rail cars must have the name of the substance stenciled on their side. Placards and label may help you identify what you're dealing with, but remember, they may fall off. They may not have to be present because they house such a low quantity of it. Shipping papers, you have to get really close to get a hold of those papers, so they may not be readily available. But when you're using your hearing, your seeing, and your smell, you've got to be in close proximity to the hazards. You can look for visual signs, vapor clouds, liquid spills, dead people, any sort of colored smoke, those sort of things. The agent pattern and potential outcome. What they're talking about here is the difference between contamination and exposure. By virtue of knowing about the chemical you're exposed, whether you become contaminated depends on what you do next. If you don't properly decontaminate the patient and put them in the back of your truck, now you're contaminated, your truck's contaminated, and it can lead to some pretty serious consequences. Some of these particular chemical exposures will present with a notable toxidrome, and the most recognizable of those are your organophosphates, your pesticides, malathion, parathion, lorsban, dursban, ortho-7, furadan. These are all pesticides that could cause a very similar reaction that a person may have when exposed to a deadly nerve agent. So they may present with a classic cholinergic toxidrome. As far as chemical movement, you want to stage yourself safely uphill, upwind, upstream. Predict the exposure pattern, particularly if you're dealing with clouds and vapors. Things like anhydrous ammonia, they have a tendency to V up. They have a tendency to rapidly expand and are lighter than air, where chlorine is a green yellowish cloud that's heavier than air and has a tendency to lay close to the bottom. State of matter has an impact on the type of victim exposure as well, and they're referring here to whether you're dealing with a liquid, a solid, or a gas. Hazardous chemicals will come in all three of those forms. The issue with gases, they can be breathed into your lungs. They also can be trapped between your clothing, and as a result of being trapped between your clothing, they can combine with the moistures on your skin and form acids and bases that can lead to significant burns. The other thing with liquids, they can be volatile or persistent. Persistent liquids have a tendency to be a little more oily. Mustard gas was very persistent. It clung to the clothing. It was hard to get rid of. And we'll talk about ways that we can get rid of it. And then solids. Lime, something used to raise the pH in soil that's really acidic, can also big piles of white powder lying in the fields, that's lime, and people can get exposed to that as well. So the state of the matter affects it as well. Some other things about state of matter include vapors. They're the greatest risk of exposure. Liquids and solids are the greatest risk for secondary contamination. Melting point refers to the point where solids become liquids. Boiling point refers to the point where liquids become vapors. And specific gravity refers to whether or not a chemical is going to sink or float. If the specific gravity is greater than water, it's going to sink. If it's less than water, it's going to float. Water solubility, how well it dissolves in water. Volatility is how easily and quickly the liquid turns into a vapor. Sarin, the deadly nerve agent, is extremely volatile. It will quickly convert from a liquid to a vapor. Vapor pressure is the pressure exerted by the vapor against the sides of a closed container, and this may have something to do with temperature as well. If pressurized contents get too cold, less pressure put on the walls. If they get overheated, then there's greater pressure put on the walls. And this whole vapor pressure might have something to do with some of the rail derailments and explosions that we're seeing with Bakken shale oil out of the Bakken fields in North Dakota. Here they're just showing you the reference to specific gravity, where gasoline has a specific gravity lighter than water at 0.66, assuming that water is 1. Gasoline is going to float on the top. It's not going to sink to the bottom, and therefore it can, because it is volatile, it can emit vapors that could ignite. In cooking, you do a flambe with brandy or some other liquid that is lighter than water, and you can ignite on purpose. Chlorine has a greater vapor density than greater vapor density than water. So when it is released out of a tank, it has a tendency to lay low and cling to the ground. You must know water solubility and vapor pressure properties, because inhaled chemicals with lower solubility can result in lower airway symptoms. They can get further down into your airways. Chemical with high vapor pressures results in increased inhalation risk as well. Here's just an example of volatility. The boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion is what's shown here. This is when pressurized containers with liquids are suddenly breached. The liquid rapidly boils and expands, and if it's flammable, it's going to result in a fireball. And I've already briefly mentioned that the Bakken shale oil, the most volatile shale oil in the world, is being transported by trains through 9 different counties in Iowa, and it is probably the result of derailments. I would imagine these tanks they're being transferred in, if they get too hot and it expands and it breaches, it is highly volatile, highly flammable, and leads to a situation like this. Vapor density is the weight of volume of pure gas compared with the weight of equal volume of pure dry air. Heavier air vapors create a greater risk of exposure and fire if they reach an ignition source. Flammability has to do with flash point. The lower the flash point, the more volatile it is. This is an example. Ether has a flash point of negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit, so even at 49 degrees below zero, ether is flammable, because at 49 degrees, 40 degrees below zero, ether is going to be emitting vapors that will ignite. And we use ether to start cars and vehicles in the dead of winter. Where if you look at turpentine, for example, turpentine has a flash point of 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So turpentine is not likely to ignite with a spark unless, unless you're got a pile of oily turpentine-soaked rags in the garage. They're always telling you to clean up those oily rags and clean up those the rags you use to clean up all your painting stuff. Don't leave them laying in the garage, because if it gets too warm in there, the flash point rises, they become vapors, and then a spark is all it takes to ignite the pile of rags. The auto ignition point is when it burns without an ignition source. Lower flammable limit is the minimum concentration necessary to ignite, and the upper flammable limit, it will not ignite, because there is not enough oxygen to support the fuel. And of course the spelling of fuel is not quite right. The flammable range is the range between the upper and lower flammable limits. Corrosivity refers to how corrosive a hazardous chemical is. Corrosivity would refer to how acidic it is and how basic it is. Very acidic products, of course, will burn the skin, and very basic products will burn the skin as well. Reactivity is the interaction that produces heat and increased corrosivity and increased toxicity. Reactivity can also include water reactive materials, air reactive materials like pyrophorics or pyroforms. Pyrophoric gas is a gas that will ignite when exposed to air. Oxidation ability. Oxidation is the ability to support combustion. So oxidizers, one of the hazardous chemicals that are transported, will support combustion. It was an oxidizer that was used in the Oklahoma City bombing. Amyl nitrate was the oxidizer, along with ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer was the oxidizer, along with diesel fuel and an ignition source. Radioactivity is a spontaneous disintegration of unstable nuclei with emission of nuclear radiation. It produces changes in matter, so it does affect our internal environment. It can destroy our immune system, destroy our ability to make red cells and white cells effectively. But it takes quite a bit of radiation to do that, to develop radiation sickness. There are several different types of radioactive particles. There are alpha particles, and they travel about 10 inches and can be blocked with a piece of paper. There are beta particles. They travel about 10 feet, and they can penetrate into the skin and into some lesser construction material. Gamma rays are what we're concerned about, because they will travel great distances, and they will penetrate even bricks and concrete. Neutron radiation is a reference to these radioactive particles. To protect yourself, remember time, distance, and shielding. Time refers to the amount of time you spend in an area with radiation. Distance, and you don't have to be that far from it. As an example, if I'm standing next to a nuclear radioactive package that is emitting 50 rad an hour and 550 rad an hour, if I'm standing next to a package of 500 rad an hour, that is a lethal dose of radiation. If I'm standing next to it and I just step 3 feet away from it, now I'm only exposed to 55 rad. And if I step another 3 feet, now I'm only exposed to 1.5 rad. And if I step another 9 feet, like I'm 9 feet away from it, I'm hardly exposed to any radiation. A chest x-ray is 1/500th of a rad. So that kind of gives you an idea. And then shielding, protect yourself with something. So here's the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and the ones that we're concerned with, of course, are the gamma rays. Now, radiation is something that we can't see, but just like any other chemical, if there's a nuclear detonation, the radioactive particles cling to your clothing and cling to your skin and can be breathed down into your lungs, etc. Injuries, when we're dealing with radiation exposure, would be from the blast. Radiation sickness, we're not going to know right away. It's not an emergency medical condition because we have no idea the amount of radiation a person has been exposed to until you see symptoms of radiation exposure. And that could take weeks, months, years to actually know the amount of radiation a person has been exposed to. So injuries would be from the blast, and so they would include the blast injuries we see from the barotrauma from the blast wave, or secondary wounds from fragmentation, particles in the blast wave, or being thrown to the ground from the blast wind, or exacerbation of our medical conditions as a result of the dust and the radiation and all those other things that are in the air. So we would treat these and then later treat their radiation exposure once it was determined what they were exposed to. So toxicology is dose and response relation. Toxic effects of exposure estimated to the exposure level. So what they're referring to here is the dose determines whether something is toxic. Everything around us is toxic. Water is toxic. Oxygen is toxic. It's the dose that determines whether or not it's toxic. Some other terms commonly used in hazmat include lethal dose, LD50, lethal concentration, LC50, and the lethal dose system is based on animals. If 100 animals receive a lethal dose or a lethal concentration of a particular hazmat, it would be hazardous substance. We would expect it to kill 50 of those 100. So half the people exposed to an LD50 and LC50 will die. Threshold limit value is the amount of time you can spend in the environment without it posing a health risk. Permissible exposure limit is the amount that you're able to be exposed to before it does cause a health risk. And IDLH environments, immediate dangers to life or health. IDLH environments are environments where there is no oxygen. And that's important to keep in mind because when we look at level C protection, that does not protect you in IDLH environments. The duration of exposure, obviously the shorter you're exposed to, the less is absorbed and the lower your response is, but an acute exposure is exposed to something less than 24 hours, and chronic, of course, would be over long periods of time. These chemicals get into our body. We can inhale them, we can ingest them, they can get in through our skin or eyes. That would be absorption. We can inject them, and that's how they get into our body. Again, the emergency response guidebook is going to give you the information on your personal protective equipment necessary, the first aid that you need to provide, as well as other information concerning the chemicals. The safety data sheets are readily available. They have to be readily available for each chemical in all work sites. So no matter where you work, there should be safety data sheets, or you should have access either through web or calling a phone number. And the OSHA requires on a safety data sheet the chemical name, the physical data, chemical ingredients, fire and explosive hazards, health hazards, reactive data, spill or leak procedures, and special protection and precaution information. The computer-aided management of emergency response, that's called CAMEO. That's an EPA database. It is a program that has chemical-specific information for chemicals, for hazards, for response recommendations, physical properties, regulatory information, alternate chemical names, and this is a computer-based software that you can get so that you can look these things up if you need to. There are telephone references that help us identify hazardous materials as well. They should be available 24/7. The problem certainly with telephone is that whenever you're talking to somebody, there's always a possible mistake when transcribing the information. There are some other organizations that make up the Chemical Manufacturers Association, or part of the Chemical Manufacturers Association, which include Chemtrec and Medtrec. And of course, as a backdrop in EMS, we always have and should strongly rely on our local Poison Control Center, and that's the number for the Poison Control Center. Your initial response should be to protect yourself, establish a safe zone. Remember the word up. Uphill, upwind, upstream. Establish command of the scene, and then set up your ICS, which may be a unified command depending on the situation. If it's a larger sort of lengthy response, then you may end up with something like area command or something like that. No rescues from contaminated areas should be attempted until you identify what the chemical is and whether or not it's safe to enter and what you need to wear when dealing with it. Screen bystanders and witnesses that show up wanting care to determine whether or not they're contaminated, and consider evacuation needs. You're going to have to limit access to properly trained response personnel. In other words, you're getting a lot of people that may want to help. You may get a lot of people that just show up to see what's going on, but we're going to have to require law enforcement to help us secure the perimeters and only allow access of properly trained medical personnel. The hot zone is an exclusion zone. The only people that go in there are patients who are people who are trained as technicians. Contamination does exist in that particular hot zone. That's where, if there are any patients left, they would be rapidly pulled from there. If trapped, they can provide stabilization and care in the hot zone, and the care should be limited control to opening an airway, controlling hemorrhage, administering oxygen, giving them an auto injector, those sort of things. Warm zone is where you can provide medical care during decontamination. You can manage the airway, breathing, circulation, C-spine stabilization, do the decon, and evaluate for a particular toxin. And you might have an antidote. You can administer oxygen in a warm zone, but you want to limit your invasive procedures, because things you're not going to do in a warm zone fully suited is start an IV, those sort of things. The cold zone is once the patient has been adequately decontaminated, they pose no danger to anybody. They can be handed over to medical caregivers. This limits contamination spread. You can put your patient on a clean stretcher and perform your BLS and ALS measures. So here's just a visual of a potential hot zone, warm zone, and cold zone in the contamination reduction corridor. If we pick a path that we take to move people in and out, we certainly limit the spread of potential secondary contamination. Your safety plan is managed by the incident-specific safety plan, which is usually developed by the safety officer and approved by the incident commander. It should be user-friendly. It should guide you during the during the incident, and changes as the scene and the condition changes as well. Personal protective equipment is there to shield you from chemical, physical, and biological hazards. And the personal protective equipment you need is dependent upon your involvement and your training. Respiratory protection, I believe that's 1910-124, the OSHA standard, deals with air purifying respirators, or SCBAs. Also could be PAPRs, positive air purified respirators, or APRs, air purified respirators. What sort of respiratory protection you're going to need depends on the oxygen concentration in the area. Identify the concentration of the substance in the area as well, the chemical and physical properties of the substance, warning properties of the substance, in other words, knowing that you may be contaminated, and the area in which the responders must operate, and then what specific tasks have to be completed in that area. Chemical protective clothing. You should wear vapor protective clothing. That's going to give you the highest protection against skin destruction and absorption. You may have to wear fully encapsulated suits depending on the hazardous materials, and those would be, your fully encapsulated suits are typically left for the technician trained person. And with your chemical protective clothing, you also want to make sure that whatever respiratory protection you need, you should have available. As an example, if you're in an IDLH environment, an environment where there is no oxygen, you can't go in there with a PAPR. You need an SCBA. Chemical splash protective clothing protects you against liquid splashes or particulates, but limited vapor protection. There are 3 levels of protection. The EPA designates level A, which is the highest level of protection, and includes a fully encapsulated SCBA. So you've got your SCBA on the inside of the suit, you're fully encapsulated, you're breathing only the air inside the tank, so you can go into environments where there is no oxygen. Level B is the highest level of respiratory protection, but it's a lower level of skin and eye protection. So in other words, you're still using an SCBA, but the SCBA is strapped on the outside of your chemical protective coveralls. And there's an example of level B. Level C is what most hospitals have. When the type of the airborne substance is known, and the concentration is measured, then you can make decisions as to whether or not you need to be wearing PAPRs, positive air purifying respirators, and chemical protective coveralls. In situations where you're dealing with anhydrous ammonia, you're dealing with Ebola, these full-faced air-purified respirators are what hospital employees should be wearing, along with their chemical protective coveralls. So here's an example of a couple people in PAPRs. They've got the full butyl hood, along with a blower motor that straps to their waist, and 3 filters on that blower motor, NIOSH filters that filter out all the methyl ethyl death. But these filters will not provide oxygen. These devices will not provide you oxygen. So if you're in an area where there is no oxygen, you'll die in these suits. Now level D is your uniform. So there's level D. Sometimes if you're far enough away, your uniform will work just fine. You can holler at the patient to remove and isolate their clothing, bag it up, and give them something to wear, and then have them step in to take a shower. Pre-entry examination, level A or B should be worn. Determine your baselines. Look at wounds, rashes, and irritations on the patient's skin. Determine their mental status. Get a baseline ECG. And recent illness in the past 72 hours. Prehydrate with sports drinks. So what they're talking about here is a pre-entry examination of the person who's going to be getting into a level A or level B personal protective equipment. You got to set some baselines. If they have any open wounds, rashes, or irritations that could potentially become contaminated, are they alert, awake, and oriented? They should have a GCS of 15. Their ECG should be good. Their vital signs should be stable. They shouldn't have had any recent illnesses like flu or diarrhea or coughing or hacking. You don't want to be doing that stuff inside those suits. You want to rehydrate them while you're getting them dressed. If their temperature is greater than 99, if their heart rate is greater than 110, if their blood pressure is greater than 150 over 90, or the respiratory rate is greater than 25, they should be denial of entry into the hot zone. Post-entry examination is the same. You get them out, you decon them, and you start looking for signs and symptoms that might indicate that they too have been exposed. Changes in gait, speech, or behavior, chest pain, dizziness, shortness of breath, weakness, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea or headaches. Remember, the heat stress is a real potential situation that you could be dealing with on hot, humid days in people that are suited up. chemical exposure, if the suit isn't put on properly, if there are exposed areas where chemicals can get inside the suit, certainly the patient can have this, or the rescuer can have the same signs and symptoms of the patient. And if they do, they're going to need to be decontaminated. Monitor their vital signs if they do come out because of heat stress until they come back to baseline. You're going to document their pre-entry exam, their post-entry exam, any treatment that you provided the rescuer, how they responded to the treatment, and then the recommendation of a paramedic and incident command as to the ability to go back out there and do it again. So your rehab folks are going to have a big say on this. You're also going to keep those documents for a period of 30 years because if they do become exposed to these particular chemicals, we don't know what sort of health risks they'll have, and so we have to keep those documents much longer. Normal medical records are purged every 7 to 10 years, but these have to be kept for 30 years. As far as decontamination goes, you're going to set up your contamination corridor. You're going to separate areas to decontaminate your responders, the patients, and the equipment. You're going to protect you're going to identify the product, the life threat, how it got into the body, and what sort of decontamination needs to be done. When you're all done with an event, then you need to be decontaminated as well, even though you're wearing personal protective equipment. So all personnel, all clothing, all equipment, all patient care equipment needs to be deconned at the end of the incident. In an ambulatory patient, you're going to be wearing your personal protective equipment. Your patient is going to exit the contaminated area. They're going to be they potentially could be provided shelter where they can remove and isolate their clothing, their jewelry, their shoes. They're going to get into a shower. They're going to rinse with warm water, not hot water. They're going to apply soap and then rinse, and then soap and then rinse. And the soap here they're saying is baby shampoo or mild soap. Any sort of dish soap, plain old Dawn, Dove, Ivory, is very good. And the reason that we like those plain old dish soap is that they have they're very good about breaking down oils. And some of these chemicals are very persistent. They're very oily. Chlorine, for an example. If you put some bleach on your fingers and rub them together, you can feel how oily and persistent that chemical is. And then if you just run it under water, it's very difficult to get that chlorine off your skin. Here's a decon shower that would shower many people at once. Just in this particular line, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it could shower 7 at once. The thing to remember about showers is that if at all possible, gender separate your patients. They do need to strip completely down. They do need some sort of privacy prior to getting into the shower, and when they step out of the shower to dry off and then be suited back up and sent into the either the ambulance or the emergency department. With your non-ambulatory patients, obviously you're going to need to haul them out of the contaminated area. You're going to have to remove and isolate their clothing and remove their jewelry and their shoes. If they've got dry contaminants on them, it talks here about brushing the contaminants off, but we're not going to brush the contaminants off because that just spreads them through the air. We use lint rollers to remove dry chemical. Powders, those sort of things, and then we remove and isolate their clothing, and then we would water, starting at the head and the face first and working your way down to the feet. So here's an example of a non-ambulatory patient being decontaminated. Mass casualty decontamination, that's an emergency decon. It's called a fast break decon. You can decontaminate large numbers of people at once. You use fire apparatuses or hoses, fire hoses from 2 different directions, 2 fire engines side by side to provide some sort of privacy. But the water is cold, and you got to be concerned about the water pressure. you can't get that so high that you roll people over. So here's pictures of what we call that the tunnel of terror. When you set that up and run people through that ice cold water. They've got to remove and isolate their clothing, and again we isolate their clothing because if it's giving off fumes, we don't want those fumes to get to us. We'll tie them up in plastic bags and isolate their clothing, and then they would go into the tunnel of terror completely naked, and water, soap, and then out, and then dried off into the ambulance or the emergency department. Patients should be decontaminated. As far as patient decontamination, whether or not the water needs to be captured during a decontamination, we rely on the Iowa Department of Natural Resources to tell us whether or not we need to hold the water. In many facilities, they have a pit. They have the ability to hold 500 gallons of water without releasing it into the sewer system. In many others, they don't. So one of the first things that a person needs to do is to call the Iowa Department of Natural Resources during a major spill to determine what to do with the chemical. If we put a lot of water on it, is it okay just to let it run on the ground? Because if you set you're doing a mass decon and you've got 2 fire trucks and they're using their charged lines and they're hosing all these people off, that water's going to go where the water goes. And nobody's going to be collecting that. And in most all situations, that's going to be just fine because you put enough water on it that you dilute it to the point where it's harmless. Some common hazardous materials include corrosives. Corrosives are designed to destroy anything they come in contact with. They are very strong acids. They're very strong bases. And when you get them on your skin, they're going to cause burns. When you get them in your airway, they're going to cause burns and swelling. If you breathe in the fumes or aspirate the corrosive, they can cause circulatory collapse, severe skin burns, a GI perforation when swallowed, hemorrhage, peritonitis. Inhalation, ingestion, and direct contact with skin is how they get into the body. Treatment: remove and isolate the clothing. That's going to eliminate 80% of all contaminants. Just remove and isolate the clothing. If they are having problems with their airway, we need to manage that effectively. We need to provide decon, which is water, 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 water. Do not induce vomiting. Monitor for pulmonary edema. Treat dysrhythmias. Start an IV at TKO. Flush the eyes with water. Irrigate irrigate their eyes continually during transport. Cover skin burns with a dry sterile dressing, and do not attempt to neutralize the corrosive. Pulmonary irritants include chlorine, ammonia. Chlorine reacts with water and forms hydrochloric acid. Ammonia reacts with water and forms ammonium hydroxide. These can be inhaled, ingested, absorbed. They cause pulmonary edema, hypotension, eye irritation, chemical skin burns, and they may form either strong alkalis or strong acids in the respiratory tract. Treatment for pulmonary irritants: again, remove and isolate the clothing, water, 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 manage the airway if necessary, ventilate if necessary. They don't recommend using mouth to mask because you could breathe in some of these fumes as well. Consider intubation, especially if you're hearing stridor. Consider bronchodilator use if you're hearing wheezing. Monitor for pulmonary edema, IVO2 as well. Organophosphates and carbamates, those are pesticides, and they're some of the most poisonous chemicals in the world. They're also the leading cause of poisoning in the world, are pesticides. They can be inhaled, ingested, they can be absorbed through the eyes or the skin. They cause respiratory failure, chemically mediated pulmonary edema, respiratory muscle paralysis, and we can remember the presenting toxidrome by Sludgeum BB, and here they have Sludge BB, where your salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastrointestinal upset, emesis, meiosis, which is pinpoint pupils, and then bronchorrhea, bronchospasm, Treatment is remove and isolate the clothing, water, 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 water. They're going to be making more spit than thought humanly necessary. So you're going to have to suction a lot, manage the airway. You may have to assist our ventilations. You may have to consider intubation, bronchodilators, monitor for the development of pulmonary edema, and monitor the cardiac rhythm and treat arrhythmias. An IV at TKO. Vasopressors if they're hypotensive. Atropine is something that we use for pesticides as well as deadly nerve agents, but it takes a tremendous amount of atropine. I've been taught to double my dose of atropine, so if my initial dose is 0.5 milligram, I would give 1. And 3 minutes later, if they're still wet, I would give 2. And 3 minutes later, I would give 4. And 3 minutes later, I would give 8. And 3 minutes later, I would give 16. And 3 minutes later, I'd give 32. We don't carry enough atropine to treat one patient who's been exposed to a pesticide or a deadly nerve agent, let alone a community. Pralidoxime or 2-PAM chloride is another medication that is given for organophosphate poisoning. It does not work on carbamates. It does work on organophosphates, but not carbamates. Seizures also can occur with pesticide poisoning. You're going to treat those with the atropination, correcting the hypoxia. In other words, lots of atropine, correct the hypoxia, and then if they're still seizing, benzodiazepines. Succinate, choline, and other cholinergic agents, as well as aminophylline, are contraindicated in pesticide poisoning. Flush the eyes and continue irrigation during transport. Chemical asphyxiants include cyanide and carbon monoxide and methane, and these victims do not need decontamination. It's not likely that the gases that they inhaled are in a high enough concentration on their body or trapped between their clothing that would cause illness to the provider. But in any event, if you've got somebody that you pulled out of a burning building that has carbon monoxide poisoning, they also have cyanide poisoning. Pull somebody out of a manure pit, they have methane poisoning, and removing and isolating the clothing will eliminate the gas that's trapped between their clothing and their skin. Treatment is going to be aggressive airway management. Ventilate them if they're not breathing. We don't induce vomiting. We monitor for pulmonary edema and monitor for arrhythmias. Certainly if they've got a lot of PVCs, that would indicate that the level of the asphyxiant is high in the system, and it's irritating the ventricles. IV at TKO. If the person is poisoned by cyanide, we need to treat with a cyanide antidote kit. There's 2 of them out there. Hydroxycobalamin is my favorite. The Lilly kit is more complicated to give. It's an old medicine kit developed in the 80s and is highly ineffective when compared to hydroxycobalamin, which is a single bolus. Turns the cyanide into vitamin B12, and in areas where they're using cyanide antidote kits, hydroxycobalamin, they've doubled their survival rates from smoke inhalation deaths. We often treat the smoke inhalation, but we fail to treat the cyanide poisoning. Treat seizures with benzodiazepines. Flush with water, remove and isolate clothing. High levels of CO poisoning, consider hyperbaric oxygen chambers. What's not addressed here is, they talk about considering hyperbaric oxygen chambers for carbon monoxide poisoning, but that is reserved for significant carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide has a half-life of roughly 4 to 6 hours. So if I do nothing, I just take them out of the environment, do absolutely nothing, 4 to 6 hours later they'll have half the amount of carbon monoxide in their system. If I give them 100% oxygen, that cuts that down to about 2 hours. If I take them to a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, that cuts it down to about 45 minutes. So depending on how much CO poisoning they have would determine whether or not we consider hyperbaric therapy. Hydrocarbon solvents include your Gugon, include paint thinner, paint strippers, lacquers, And on all those labels, it tells you to use them in a well-ventilated area, because breathing in the fumes can lead to dysrhythmias, pulmonary edema, and respiratory failure, as well as seizures. Long-term exposure to hydrocarbon solvents can lead to brain and kidney and liver damage as well. Treatment is to remove and isolate the clothing, water if they poured it all over them. Aggressive airway management. If they are wheezing, give them a bronchodilator. If they've ingested it, we don't induce vomiting. We monitor for the potential development of pulmonary edema from an acute lung injury. Check their cardiac rhythm, start an IV at TKO, and avoid epinephrine. As far as patient transport goes, you want to notify the hospital early in case they have to get things ready, set up their decon area, etc. Because the vast majority, it says here that some victims may self-transport. In major incidences, 80% of the victims are going to self-transport. EMS will bring the remaining 5 or 10% along with law enforcement. As far as the number of patients go, you can let them know the number of patients that you have, but a good rule of thumb when you're dealing with a situation like this is the rule of 10. For every one patient that's actually exposed, you may touch 10 in one way or the other. You've got your exposed patient, and then you have family and friends of the exposed patient, and then you have all those people that hear on the radio that, hey, some methyl ethyl death was just released from this chemical company, and it causes watery eyes and a itchy nose and a cough. Well, everybody in town with watery eyes, itchy nose, and a cough is going to think they've been exposed to methyl ethyl death, and they're going to come to the emergency room or call 911 for treatment. So you're going to have a lot more people to deal with than who are actually ill. Try to determine the nature of the incident. You want to reduce secondary contamination. That's the important thing. You're going to be exposed by knowing about it, but whether or not you become contaminated, your truck becomes contaminated, depends on what you do here. Non-essential equipment should be removed before you transport the patient. Cover the walls and the ceiling of the ambulance with plastic. So, if you've not done so in your local squads, and it's something you can do, drape an ambulance. Spend some time taping all the covers off and taping the floor and the ceiling off, so that fumes and particles and things don't contaminate the interior of your ambulance. That does take some time. And you have to have adequate ventilation in the transport vehicle as well. We use reverse isolation techniques just like they do in a hospital. Remember that vomit may also contain volatile compounds, and that you may have to wear personal protective equipment during transport if the patient was not properly decontaminated. Secondary contamination prevention also includes residual contamination of equipment and residual contamination of the ambulance. When it's all done, there'll be an incident debriefing, a post-incidental analysis and review. The cause will be assessed, the response procedures will be assessed, and what we call an after-action report will be written, identifying a performance improvement plan that says, hey, this worked well, this didn't work so well, this is what we need to do to fix it, this is who's going to fix it, and this is when it's going to be done. And that way you can have loop closure, making sure that those things we identify in these events are taken care of. Remember, too, that when you're dealing with a hazmat situation, particularly of large volume of people, that it's a mass casualty incident and carries a heavy emotional stress, especially if there are fatalities. All right, so with that, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me, and I will talk to you soon.